So you must have developed a political stripe. How did you come to meet the former President Reagan? And tell us this story. How did the connection initially happen?
You know, it's sometimes I'm glad you're asking about it because I don't talk about it as much as I used to as life gets further and further away from it. But I do love talking about it. I grew up not in a political family. Not, I mean, I'll say this: my mom was not a Ronald Reagan fan by any means, and
Well,
so
Reagan, sorry, Reagan had a kind of an interesting political career. He switched parties. He
yeah,
came into politics from acting. For all you young people out there, he was an actor first,
right,
then moved into politics, kind of like what Arnold Schwarzenegger did later. And I think
yeah.
because he came to politics from the outside, there were a lot of people that weren't a fan. And then when he switched parties, everybody just said, "This guy's not going to amount to anything."
Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
your mom came from that camp.
Well, my mom's a pretty liberal Democrat, and she remembers Ronald Reagan not so much as president, although certainly, but as governor first. She was
Right,
California, and
right.
he was her
Yeah.
governor, and so she's had a long history with him. But anyway, my point was I wasn't politically connected. I needed an internship my last semester at USC in the political science department, and I thought, um, well, let me see what's available. And I went and looked in this binder in this office at the political science department, and was flipping through, and there was a lot of different potential options. They were all kind of in memo format, and there were two that stood out. One was with CNN, and one was with the office of Ronald Reagan. And I I reached
Oh,
out to both of them kind of naively. I really didn't, again, I wasn't politically connected. I didn't really understand protocol, but I remember I called the office of Ronald Reagan and said, I asked for the person whose name was on the sheet, and she didn't work there anymore because they hadn't even updated their records in a while. And I got to talking to the woman, her name was Sherry, and then she put me through to the chief of staff, who was Joanne Drake. After a while, we talked, and then she said, "Well, why don't you come in and meet with me?" So then I went in, and Ronald Reagan at the time, he was post-presidency, I should say, just to make it clear to everybody. His post-presidential office was in Los Angeles. It was in Century City at the time. And for any of you people who watched or like the movie Die Hard, his office was in the Nakatomi Tower from Die Hard, the big site.
oh,
He was on
wow.
the top floor of that building. In fact, the scenes in Die Hard that are being filmed in what looks like a building out office suite this is the suite that became the office of Ronald Reagan. So anyway, that's a little
Wow.
trivia. That's Fox Plaza Tower in Century City. And so I drove up there, and I took the elevator up to the 34th floor of this Fox Plaza Tower in Century City, and the doors open, and there's Ronald Reagan busts and artwork and everything all around. And I really was just a green kid that didn't have the proper amount of understanding of what the gravity of what I was doing. But I started interviewing with Sherry Litzo, again was her name. And then eventually I went and met with Mrs. Reagan's assistant at the time. And then I went and met with the chief of staff, Joanne Drake. And, this was in, I think, May. And she said, we're going to move offices. President did have Alzheimer's at that time, was still doing pretty fine, but was slowing down and not coming into the office as much. And we certainly weren't having the amount of visitors and guests in the office suite. So they were going to downsize into a smaller office. And they said, we really want to hire a college student to help us move this summer for pay. And then you could do the internship for school credit in the fall. And I said, okay. And so I started the next week, and I went and hadn't met President or Mrs. Reagan yet, but it seems like all interns always start on the phone. So I remember sitting at a desk and the phone would ring, and I'd answer at office of Ronald Reagan. And probably one or two calls in, really, I answered office of Ronald Reagan. And this woman said, "Joanne, please." And I said, "May I ask who's calling?" And she said, "Well, it's Mrs. Reagan." And, and I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. And here, I don't know how to use the phone and press the hold buttons and do all of that right." And so then I finally figured out, and I transferred back to Joanne. And I'll never forget, I could hear Joanne say, "Oh, I'm sorry, ma'am. Yeah, that's Ethan. He's our new intern." And Mrs. Reagan, flash forward all these years later, I spent so much time with Mrs. Reagan, and she was really like family to me. I as time went on, I obviously met the president and started spending time with him, and then with Mrs. Reagan. And as he stopped coming into the office, we started going to his house, their house in Bel Air. We'd bring stuff to them. So every day I'd go up and spend time with the Reagans at their Bel Air mansion. just really was a weird time for the next 3-4 years of my life. So I graduated college. They hired me full time. Actually, it was like a 3/4 time, and then I started doing law school at night. So I was going to law school at night. I was with the Reagans during the day, and it was really just an amazing kind of experience that I never would have expected based on my background and based on the true lack of connections that I had in the political world.
That's like the coolest thing I've ever heard.
Yeah, well, when I hearing myself talk about it now, I think, oh God, that really was cool. Ethan, you should think about this stuff more often. Like, I mean, I always wondered, truth be told, I wonder, like, oh man, am I peaking too early in life? Like, it was a big deal, Here I'm with Ronald and Nancy Reagan, and then like George Bush would call, and then George W. Bush would call, and I'd be putting the phone through and talking to these people, and like George W. was president at the time, and it just was like, this is so surreal. But I did get a political, education at that point, and my interest in politics obviously grew tremendously then. But honestly, I never thought I'd be a candidate myself. I always thought, oh, I love working behind the scenes, helping people, and so that's kind of where I thought my path was going to be. And
yeah,
here I am now. It's not the case.
How much? I'm almost uncomfortable asking this question, which is weird because I'm not shy.
Yeah.
Can you share a story about an experience with Mr. Reagan that would tell us about the man, maybe something that might be surprising or unusual? I don't want to put him in an unflattering way necessarily, but do you talk like that? Do you ever share things like that?
Yeah, I'm pretty cautious. The interesting thing was really there were only 4 or 5 of us that were with him the last couple of years of his life, plus some nurses and Secret Service agents, and we're close. I mean, that bonded us together like nothing else, and we are pretty cautious about what we talk about. But I would never tell an unflattering story about him. I think that would be disrespectful. But he definitely, if you know anything about Alzheimer's, it's degenerative and things go downhill, sometimes fast, sometimes it's flatlines for a little bit. But he always was, kind. Like, he was not an angry Alzheimer's patient. He, and certainly I witnessed a stage where it went from him being able to kind of sit up and have some conversations to, he ended up laying down in a hospital bed, and that's how he spent the last part of his life. But, I remember, I don't remember when it was, but I remember going out to visit once from the office. I drove up and got called to the gates, and Mrs. Reagan was out of town. She was in Newport News, Virginia, I think, christening the USS Ronald Reagan aircraft carrier. And President was sitting out in a chair they had a really beautiful patio that looked out over Century City in Los Angeles and their pool and all the stuff. And he was sitting out there, and he had a ball cap on, and I came up, and his speech had got more difficult for him at that point. But I got there, and first thing he did was put his hand out to shake it and say hello, and he smiled. It was a really warm Ronald Reagan smile, and he always had a twinkle in his really deep blue eyes. And he was just, for somebody who was such a big presence on the world stage, even he could be so intimate in these little settings, I guess is my point. Some celebrities are, larger than life, and you feel like there's always like a wall between you, and they kind of glow around, right? My hands look a little scary for those who are watching. Sorry, but he could relate one-on-one with somebody just as well as he could relate with 100,000 people from a big stage, right? And he was so warm that day. I remember just kind of looking at me, and he kind of told a joke, but he didn't tell it very well. And he turned into somebody who, he was always a great listener, but he was a great storyteller too. When he couldn't tell stories as much, he really loved to listen, and he would kind of lean in, and he wanted to know what I was going to say, or anybody would say. So a lot of my memories are of that, and I do remember that specific day so well, just because he was Ronald Reagan, the great leader, but he was also just this nice older gentleman who was, warm and friendly, and wanted to connect with people. And that's the sad, one of the many sad things about Alzheimer's and his role and Mrs. Reagan's protection of him is he didn't have he couldn't go out at a certain point because she didn't want him to be embarrassed. So he really became kind of a prisoner of his home. And She was very protective of who got to see him as he progressed. So not a lot of people went up to the house. Really, two of his kids and staff, and that's it. Even
Yeah.
she didn't even have their friends over, and so he really loved it when we'd come and engage him and talk to him. And that to me, I remember that day as something just it's hard to, like, you're talking about your airplane trip earlier. It doesn't sound like much as I'm telling it now, but it's ingrained in my mind of like 3 hours of an afternoon with him that were just so special. And then if I can, his last birthday, he died on June 5th, 2004. Well, his birthday was in February. So February 6th, 2004. Again, Mrs. Reagan was up at the Reagan Library doing an event for his birthday. And the nurse and I, his head nurse at the time, conspired to bring him some birthday lunch. And he loved cheeseburgers and French fries and chocolate milkshakes. And Mrs. Reagan was always very protective of the food he ate and everything, but she was gone. So I snuck to In-N-Out Burger. Anyone who's out in the West knows about In-N-Out Burger. Got him his cheeseburger, got him the fries, got him the chocolate shake, and we brought it up to him. And we're helping him eat, and he's eating. And he was 4 months from death at that point. So he'd progressed pretty far, but still eating this cheeseburger and loving it and happy. You could tell he was happy. But then we realized that the whole house now smelled like French fries, and Mrs. Reagan was going to be home in about 45 minutes. And so we then spent the next 15, 20 minutes opening every window and getting fans out and trying to clear out the French fry smell. So that was our big conspiracy. And you talk about political scandals. Ours was related to a French fry smell and what Mrs. Reagan would do to us if she found out. But they were amazing.
I don't know whose wrath would be greater, the former president or Nancy's.
She was pretty tough. She was a wonderful, wonderful woman, but she was a fierce protector of the president, and to the very end, and even with his legacy up until her passing in 2016. I mean, she stayed on message and on point in protecting him, and you have to admire her for that.